Our guest today has the toughest job in state government. Some might argue that the governor has the toughest job, and that is really not true. And I'm going to tell you why. Because our guest today has to say no far more often than does the governor. The governor can always say, and I quote, "Find it, John," unquote. Our guest today is the Chief Operating Officer for the state of Illinois. He earned an MBA from the University of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago the Chief Operating Officer for the state of Illinois, John Filan. John?
Okay. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. This mic in the right place. Can you all hear? A little bit. How's that? Is that better? How's that? Good? Very good. Thanks again for having me back again this year for our annual discussion. Some people today told me that the applause I just received might be the last clap I get today. In any event, I noticed coming in a lot of alumni from the governor's first term, some of who Jay mentioned, and I always remember people that come into government from the private sector, they're not in too long and they're yearning to get back in there again, and people like Tim Martin and Paul Campbell, Jack Hartman, and Mike Roman, who's out there as well, express that hunger, but I noticed they always come back to gatherings like this. They can't quite get it out of their blood, you know, to somehow stay involved in this. And it is important to stay involved. And I think the governor appreciates, as I do, but particularly the governor, the commitment they made for the first term and how they helped move us forward into what we think is a better state government than when they started. So I want to thank them on behalf of the governor for what they did for the state of Illinois. As you know, the governor proposed a couple of weeks ago in his annual State of the State and budget address combined, a really far-reaching proposal on behalf of, we think, the people of the state. And if you take a look at what we've facing in the state, a lot of it is not things we haven't discussed before. Mike, if you turn to the first page. We've had some long-standing issues, commonly referred to as structural budget issues in the state. It included, usually when we talked about it, not including the service economy in our tax base, which has been the case for over a quarter of a century in Illinois. An ineffective and outdated corporate income tax system, which is true here in Illinois, but also true in virtually every state in the country, where there are about 45 states that have corporate income taxes. And also the size and growth of state government and how we manage that both now and going forward. In particular, one of the long-standing issues that has been the issue that has really gotten in the way of moving forward in Illinois, and particularly crowded out, to use some terms, our ability to be effectively supporting education and healthcare, has been the state pension system, not just for state employees, but also for our teachers throughout the state and state university employees as well. That number about 600,000 people throughout the state. For more than 30 years, 30 consecutive years, those pension funds were underfunded, and not by a little, but by a lot, which we'll get into later. The unfunded liability today is $40.7 billion, $41 billion, a number that's almost hard to believe no matter what industry you might be in. And the unpaid debt, that $41 billion, is accruing interest at 8.5% as we sit here. So it's an overwhelming liability the state has built up over the last 3 decades. If you go to the next slide, Mike. At the same time, we have some long-standing obligations. I mentioned the structural budget. We did reduce the size of government in the last 4 years. Illinois' payroll is 13,000 fewer employees than it was when we came into office, down from 69,000 to 56,000 today, and holding there. We did change the direction of government spending. In the past, much was spent inside state government and operations and not enough on outside state government, primarily education and healthcare. And you'll see from what I mentioned, both in terms of the employee reduction as well as the overall total of operational spending, that inside state government has been flat the last 5 years, whereas funding in healthcare, education, things outside government has been where we've had all of our growth. And thirdly, and today, we're proposing revenues that grow with the economy, a long-time need in terms of the structural issues here in Illinois. On pensions, we did initiate several pension reforms that was supported in 2005 by a number of people and opposed by some, and I'll talk later about the impact they had. We did increase the funded ratio to 60%. When we came into office, it was 48%. But that wasn't enough. We have to reduce the future deferment of payments and reduce the pension debt to an affordable level if we're going to have structural reform in our budget. On health care, those are longstanding obligations as well. We did introduce the All Kids program effective last year, where every child in Illinois now has access to health care throughout this state. It's not for free. They pay premiums based on their income levels on a sliding scale, but they have access to health care, which we think is a fundamental right for any child growing up in Illinois or elsewhere. We also manage family care, where 400,000 additional families now have health insurance and access to health insurance they did not have 4 years ago. Managed care. For 30 years, Illinois talked about the importance of putting managed care in the Medicaid program. This administration did that. Starting last July, we have 2 managed care programs in place. One, for all Medicaid recipients, we have something called primary care case management, where each Medicaid recipient has a medical home, as it's called, but a doctor assigned to them who manages their care and avoids the emergency room rather than the person reacting to medical problems and going to the emergency room or other expensive sources of care. We also have a disease management system. Both of these are outsourced, by the way, to the private sector, that manages the very expensive diseases such as diabetes, asthma, and others that really drive the cost of health care. Diabetes, as many of you may have read, is the #1 growing illness in the United States, and far more than the rest of the world. At the same time, having taken those steps for all kids, family care, and managed care, we still have today 1.4 million adults in our state, Illinois, that do not have access to health insurance or don't have health insurance. Education, also a long-standing obligation that's been discussed for decades in this state. We invested $3.8 billion in the last 4 years in primary through the 12th grade education funding. That's more than any 4-year term in the history of Illinois. We opened access to universal preschool throughout this state for the first time in this state's history. We raised performance standards for high schools 2 years ago to improve the expectations of what the results are at the high school level. But even with that, we have the remaining issue of the growing inequity in school funding. We believe the governor's proposal of 2 weeks ago addresses each of these 4 critical points to move Illinois forward. I'm going to start with a little bit of where we started. As most of you know from prior presentations and your own involvement in government, 4 years ago we had an expected $5 billion operating deficit starting in the summer of 2003. At that time, we had a $43 billion pension debt that was only funded at 48%, meaning assets versus liabilities. We had a $4.1 billion existing historical deficit in terms of generally accepted accounting principles according to annual state audits. $4.1 billion built up before the governor came into office. We had an inflated state payroll that I talked about earlier, and we'd already lost 250,000 jobs due to the recession in Illinois. We've made some progress since then. The operating deficit we expected in the end of 2003 and 2004 was eliminated. We ended up with a surplus that year. We reduced the long-term pension debt by investing $13.3 billion of hard cash into those pension funds that were underfunded for 30 years. And with that, we increased the funding level from 48% to 60.5% where it is today. But even with that, it's not near enough. We reduced the historical audited deficit by 44%, where today it's down from $4.2 billion in fiscal 03 to $2.3 billion as of the June 30, 2006 annual audit. And we reduced the payroll by 13,000 positions, saving over $900 million annually structurally in the budget going forward. On the job side, Illinois leads the Midwest in job growth for the last 3 years. In January, Illinois ranked #1 in the country in the number of jobs gained, almost 20,000 jobs in that month alone. And the 3-month moving average, our unemployment rate was 4.3% in January, the lowest it's been on a 3-month moving average basis since 1999, the boom years in Illinois. So we've made much progress, but there's much further to go. A brief review of those results I mentioned. This gives you a snapshot from 1982 to 2006 of the annual audited general accepted accounting principle GAAP basis deficits, and you can see there were more red years than black years. The last 3 years were the 3 completed fiscal years of the governor. You can see he's 2 for 3, not a bad batting average, and we expect in 2007 to be a surplus as well. Going forward, if you look at that in terms of the cumulative effect of that, during Governor Edgar's first term, there was a $163 million surplus for those 4 years. His second term, $901 million. In Governor Ryan's term, there was a cumulative deficit for those 4 years of $3.9 billion. In this governor's first 3 years, the cumulative surplus for just those 3 years is $1.8 billion, more than any time in the history of Illinois. So in conclusion, if you look at the history here and what's happened to the cumulative deficit of Illinois, it's improved substantially so that now we stand where we've cut that deficit in half that was built up over the last 20 years, and this year we expect a further surplus to keep moving Illinois forward. Before we get into the governor's proposals going forward, a big part of that is getting our existing house further in order first. And that really gets around the pension system. Some people have said, and I think they're right, there is no greater financial challenge to our state government, or to, for that matter, our state citizens, than the pension debt that we've allowed to accumulate over the last 30 years. This chart depicts not the funding, but the underfunding of the pension systems each and every year since 1982. On average, between 1982 and 2003, when the governor came into office, the average underfunding was $850 million per year. Just think about in those terms, how much they let that mortgage build up over time, and the interest that puts on the people. So that's where we started with a $43 billion unfunded pension debt in 2003. Going forward in this budget, the governor proposes a major restructuring of the pension plan. On the far left, the blue graph, is in 1996 when the pension debt was only, I say that with a certain amount of cynicism, was only $20 billion. The funded ratio was 52.3%. If we follow that plan exactly that was adopted in 95, a 50-year funding plan, by 2005, we still would have been 52.5% funded. No progress whatsoever. Instead, the reforms that were adopted 2 years ago and the infusion of cash in the last 4 years, although not enough, improved that funded ratio in 2005 to 60.3%, and it stands there today in 2006 as well. The governor's proposal would immediately infuse $26 billion into this $41 billion debt so that next year we would move the pension funding level to 83% of assets to liabilities. 83%. That would not be achieved for 34 more years under the existing funding plan, not till 2041. This proposal moves it there tomorrow and cuts that interest rate down so substantially, so that by 2040, 5 years sooner than the existing plan, we'll have reached 90% funding in Illinois. What that means as a result of this restructuring is we will save $60 billion, $60 billion over the next 40 years if we follow this plan as opposed to the existing plan in terms of outright cash disbursements from tax proceeds here in Illinois. Next chart gives you a snapshot I mentioned earlier. This was the impact of how we took a long view of this with the help of several of you in this room actually, and did pass some pension reforms 2 years ago. The result of that was to reduce that long-term liability 40 years from now and 30 years from now by 16% or $83 billion. If we hadn't done that, our overall liability would be $500 million in 2045, $530 billion, pardon me, rather than $447 billion. So that was the long-term view of trying to get that long spending curve flattened out a bit going forward in doing so. This proposal takes that existing funding plan. If you look at the blue line on top, starting in 2007, going forward to 2045, you can see the unbelievable peaking in growth of the funding requirements to fund that plan to 90%, especially in the last 5 years, 2040, 2045 at the end here. You can see that line spike up almost immeasurably to almost $16 billion per year, and what we call, and not affectionately, what it would cost our grandchildren to fund if we don't act and act today. The red line represents, if we adopt this plan, a predictable, stable, affordable funding plan that by 2040, 5 years sooner, reaches 90% funding, and the result of following that red line plan, the difference between the red line and the blue line, all the way out, is $60 billion of fewer disbursements to the pension funds over that period of time. The green line on the bottom just shows you, independent of the unfunded liability, how much pension costs will grow over the next 40 years, just in terms of how much employees at the universities, teachers, and state employees earn throughout their career. So you can see from the result of this, this is a major, major restructuring of the state's existing budget. The next page just summarizes much of what I discussed and how we reach the funding goals so much sooner and by 2040. and basically replacing it with two mechanisms. One, our proposal is to lease the Illinois State Lottery to a private operator. It would be a long-term lease for which the state would be both the oversight body and regulate. We expect that to produce $10 billion of proceeds to the state. In addition, to issue, similar to 2003, a $16 billion pension obligation bond at an interest rate of just under 6% versus the 8.5% we currently pay to the pension debt. And those two things together would produce a $26 billion infusion into the state pension systems and give us the result of a $60 billion savings from doing that. The result of that, if you can see this chart from the back, possibly not, is to take a look at the existing budget without any other programs whatsoever. In 2008, we could have a balanced budget between revenues and expenditures without any new programs to do so. But if we don't make that cash infusion I just mentioned, if we don't make the cash infusion to that pension liability, by 2011, our annual deficit will be $1.6 billion. And we'll have a deficit in 2009 and 2010 as well, over $1 billion. And what that means is that's $1.6 billion that we have to pay. It isn't just an accounting entry, we have to pay it. If we do act and adopt a plan like this, then by 2011, rather than having a deficit each and every year, we'll have a structurally sound deficit with recurring revenues and recurring expenses because of the restructuring of the pension plan. And as a result, you can see the 2011 budget and the years in between and going forward would be balanced. So that's our first reform to really get the existing base budget in structural shape. Going forward, the governor made three major proposals in his budget address on issues that have long faced our state, and for that matter, our country, in terms of our responsibilities and obligations to our citizenry. The first was in health care. There is a health care crisis in this country, and most of you are very familiar with it. Even with the actions we've taken, there are 1.4 million adults in Illinois that do not have health insurance, an astounding number. 320,000 of those people are adults who are at 100% or less of the federal poverty level. That means they are at $10,000 or less of annual income if they're single, and they're $20,000 or less for a family of four that do not have health insurance or access to it. 800,000 of those people are what you loosely call the middle class, people between $20,000 and $80,000 for a family of four who do not have health insurance or access to it. What we did is we took the work of the healthcare task force that started about 18 months ago and looked at it very closely. They had proposed a mandated health insurance plan for all the uninsured. We took that work and worked with their actuarial firm, Navigant and Mathematica, and developed a series of estimates and cost estimates. We then separately hired another actuarial firm called Mercer Consulting, and we had them audit, if you will, the assumptions and the estimates and the provisions of the Navigant model. So we did much vetting of this analysis to make sure we arrived at conservative numbers. And as a result of that, we proposed the plan the governor laid out called Illinois Covered. It basically addresses these five areas of insurance. One is focused on small business for companies with employees of 25 or less. Second is a Illinois Covered rebate, which is a premium subsidy for those between $20,000 and $80,000 of income if you're a family of four on a sliding scale basis, so the higher your income, the more you would pay. And the third is funding the 320,000 people, adults, that are under the poverty level here in Illinois to do so. So the three components are a premium subsidy for those in the middle class that do not have health insurance, access to health insurance for all others who are not insured by having a guaranteed Illinois product. They'll have a reinsurance program where we basically provide reinsurance for the catastrophic end and therefore make it a more affordable product. But people have to buy that themselves. And thirdly, the product for the poor, those that are below $20,000 of income if they're a family of four. This next is a brief graph that shows that the 1.4 million, roughly 300,000 of those are the poor I mentioned. About 800,000 will get a premium subsidy if they're between $20,000 and $80,000 in a family of four. And the remaining 300,000 is Illinois Covered Choice, where we provide a product with catastrophic coverage paid for by the state to make it more affordable for those that are above the quote middle class level, but still have no insurance and they have access to possibly buy it if they choose to. So it's not a mandated program, it is unmandated, but it does provide access to the entire 1.4 million people on a more affordable basis, and particularly focuses on small and medium-sized businesses to let them have the kind of product they need to offer their employees and to keep their employees. The next chart just summarizes basically what I discussed and breaks down the cost of the plan, but the primary cost of the plan is $2.1 billion once it's fully operational in today's dollars. About half of that, not quite, is to fund the health insurance for the poor and put them in the Medicaid program, those people that are below $20,000 a year of income. Another $850 million is basic to provide premium subsidies for those between $20,000 and $80,000 that aren't able to afford a $12,000 or $15,000 premium in their annual budgets. And the balance is funding to increase the access for people that are aged, blind, and disabled to health insurance as well. So that summarizes the governor's health care proposal. Once again, it's designed to provide access, not mandated, to the 1.4 million adults in Illinois who do not have access to health insurance today. The other major proposal is to address the funding inequity here in Illinois, where we have the imbalance between property taxes and state resources to fund our schools throughout the state. The proposal is to provide $10 billion in our primary through 12th grade schools, public schools throughout Illinois over the next 4 years. Next year, it'll start at $1.5 billion, but over the 4 years, it'll total $10 billion of new money. This is the largest one-year increase ever, and certainly the following years will be even larger than that, to shift the burden and to shift the funding responsibility more towards the state and less off property taxes, which has been a goal of this state, I think, for the last 25 years. In addition to that, there's a series of performance and accountability measures that we will put in legislation that we expect the schools to respond to as a result of this increased funding. And a big part of this will be trying to focus the investment on results, not just additional funding. Just graphically speaking, this gives you the indication of how much this increase represents, just going to $1.5 billion by fiscal year 08. There's many years in the past where state funding was flat, received some modest increases in other years. But it wasn't until the last 5 years where we see a significant and demonstrable increase in the state government stepping up to the plate and taking its responsibility for state funding for public education. So we've talked about 3 areas of the budget that we think were critical to put us in structural shape. One is to do a major reform to the pension crisis that has existed here in Illinois for the last 30 years. Secondly, to address the uninsured in Illinois and provide them access to health insurance. We believe an obligation of our state and of our citizenry. And thirdly, to change the funding inequity in Illinois between property taxes and state government revenues. To do that, we're proposing a revision to the tax system we also think long overdue. Illinois, like many states, has a rather unfair tax system. Many of the taxes we currently have are regressive, and in particular, we have found that the corporate income tax is not only regressive in many ways, but it's also ineffective, and that's true really in most state governments. The Federal Reserve Board in Boston the other day indicated that most corporate income taxes around the country are really unenforceable because of the ease of moving money across both domestic and foreign borders and not being able to confine the economic activity for tax purposes inside a state's border. By example, and these are not cherry-picked numbers, there's no set of numbers from the Department of Revenue that would arrive at a different conclusion. But if you look at the second part of the graph here, many large businesses do avoid taxes, not so much because of loopholes, that's part of it, but more because of apportioning money across state borders. As an example, on average, between 1997 and 2004, for those 8 years, nearly half of all corporations that had at least $50 million of sales in Illinois. In fact, they had average sales of about $300 million in Illinois. Nearly half of those companies did not pay any state income taxes throughout that 8-year period. Mostly due, once again, to be able to shift income and expenses across state borders. A further example is of the Fortune 100 companies, 99 of those do business in Illinois. Of those 99, 37 of those companies did not pay state income taxes in Illinois, even though those 37 companies had average sales of $1.2 billion in Illinois in doing so. Those same companies had profits reported to the SEC of over $96 billion in that period, referring to 2004, and yet those companies paid no income taxes here in Illinois. So the evidence is really overwhelming that our corporate income tax system in Illinois and elsewhere is really broken and ineffective. It was largely designed for the old economy in the early 70s, which is more so a goods economy and based on traditional corporate structures in doing so. But generally since then, the goods-based economy, largely manufacturing, wholesaling, and retailing, and mining and the like, make up about 1/3 of our economy, but pay well over half of our corporate income taxes. On the other hand, service-based businesses make up about 2/3 of our economy, but pay only less than half of the corporate income tax. And when you exclude certain service industries, the amount gets to be extremely small. And much of that is due to the restructuring of how businesses operate in Illinois and elsewhere. Since we adopted the corporate income tax, the tax base that was envisioned has changed. In the early 80s, the number of sub-S corporations, LLCs, and LLPs were approximately 85,000. Today, that number is almost 300,000. So the shift of corporate structure in terms of how they operate has changed dramatically in Illinois, but our tax system has not changed with it. This all happened subsequent to the adoption of the corporate income tax in doing so. So in looking at this, we looked at other options that were available to us versus the gross receipt tax that we proposed. We reviewed the corporate income tax, but for some of the reasons I just cited, it's ineffective. It tries to tax a number that is managed and a number that is not really reliable in terms of state revenues, and has too much discrimination among and within industries in terms of who pays and who does not. Individual income taxes in Illinois is already regressive. It's a flat income tax rate, as you know. The Constitution requires that. And consequently, we think extending that would be even more regression than we currently have, and would focus on more and more taxation out of middle income and lower income families. And the sales tax on services, I think, is the most regressive, because in a very narrow base of the economy, you're going to have 5% and as much as 9.25%, in Chicago here as an example, on the products you'd apply sales tax to. So if you applied the sales tax to services here in Illinois, you'd be adding almost 10% at the end of the product line to the cost of that service you pay for today. And we think that would be exceptionally regressive on the type of services that are contemplated in that proposal. So the result of this is we propose a gross receipt tax very comparable to the rates the state of Washington has in place, and the gross receipt tax has been in place there since the mid-30s. If you step back for a second and consider that all taxes are imperfect and disruptive, but look at them comparatively, not in isolation. Any one tax, you can list a bunch of warts and a bunch of problems with it, whether it's property tax or sales tax or income tax, and all the parts of it that are ineffective. But if you look at them comparatively, you find out that a tax like this has a critical advantage, and that is it does minimize the imperfection, it does minimize the disruption, because the base is so broad throughout the economy, it touches every sector of the economy with virtually no exceptions, that you're allowed to have a minimal rate. The minimal rate basically minimizes the disruption, and it minimizes the imperfections that are inherent in any tax, because you can't contemplate every individual situation. Whereas other taxes, by being a narrower base, require a higher rate, and consequently the things you do tax have more disruption because of the higher rate in doing so. Overall, we'd raise a little over $6 billion net to the state as a result of this tax. The rate would be 1/2 of 1% on the goods economy and 1.8% on the services economy. They're very comparable rates to what is generally in place in the state of Washington. Any residual corporate income taxes paid would be 100% credited against it, so there'd be no double taxation, and the gross receipt tax would prevail in all those cases. I mentioned a minute ago about looking at things not in isolation but comparatively. If you take a look at this next table, I hope, we have on the left the governor's proposal, other proposals. There's a bill pending in the General Assembly that's like this, or doing nothing, which is, I suppose, an alternative, but doesn't really move our state forward. The governor's proposal does include all sectors of the economy that are not left out, and consequently it allows a low, minimally disruptive rate of 0.5% on goods and 1.8% on services. But what does it accomplish? It does fund education in a major way and change the fundamental inequity of property tax versus income tax. It does provide access to health care to 1.4 million people that don't have it today. We think a fundamental right here in Illinois. It does manage the pension problem and get it under control so we can afford to fund these pensions for the first time in the history of the state. And it does provide structural budget reform going forward, so not just this year, but 4 and 5 years forward, we can see the state's budget in balance and not worry about a new hole developing a few years from now. Other proposals want to raise the income tax from 3% to 5%. That's a 67% increase in the current tax. And remember, that's a tax on all your income, not just your wages. It's on your income, your spouse's income, your investment income, any income you have. It also would increase the corporate income tax to 8%. So those corporations that are paying income taxes would have their taxes almost doubled, and those corporations that aren't paying income taxes 8% times 0 is still 0, okay? They would continue to pay no income taxes. So that would further promote the unfairness of taxation among corporations and businesses. It also would increase sales taxes on services, many services in the economy here in Chicago to 9.25%. So you can see those kind of rates on the base that it would tax would provide a great deal of disruption as compared to the broader all-sector base in the gross receipt tax. What would it accomplish? It would fund education somewhat comparably to what we have in our proposal, although ours is somewhat higher. It provides no access to health care, no improvement to health care whatsoever in our economy. It extends the pension liability 50 additional years, which means we continue to be chasing that 8.5% debt for 5 more decades. And it provides no structural changes in the Illinois state budget. We don't find ourselves with a more stable revenue going forward to fund our continuing requirements in the state. Or we could do nothing, and there'd be no funding for education, there'd be no access to health care, we could ignore the pension liability, and I can assure you in a few years the pension liability will be tens of $billions higher and will be that much further in debt, and it'll come back on us once again to find out the problem. And I should mention, by the way, that pension liability is a constitutional guarantee. It's not one we can negotiate ourselves out of. And we have no structural reform, and we'd be in the same dilemma we are here in Illinois today. Just quickly, regarding the proposal, on the pyramid question, it's something that we think we mitigate substantially. We don't eliminate, but the differential structure of 0.5% on the good side, where most pyramiding occurs if it does occur, mitigates it substantially versus 1.8% on services. We do apply the gross receipt tax to imports. It's a very important plan, so out-of-state companies cannot take any advantage of in-state companies in terms of their relative pricing of their taxes and products. We exclude exports very purposely, so there are so many tax systems in this country and around the world that to try to compete with all the different tax systems, we'd spend years figuring it out. The importance of that is really critical. Well over half of Illinois manufacturing are exports. So all of those out-of-state transactions, both domestic and foreign, would be excluded from this tax. Agriculture, 44% of agriculture in Illinois are foreign exports. We don't have a number for domestic exports, but you can see a very substantial part of agriculture production would be exempted from this proposal. Affiliated sales are excluded. Unlike Washington, Illinois and Ohio have a combination rule where if there's intercompany activity between subsidiaries and affiliates, those would be combined and eliminated in the tax report, so they wouldn't be taxed. And we've also included certain essential products. Illinois has a long history of excluding food and medicine from state sales tax, and we would exclude retail food and retail medicine from the GRT. In general, the question about being passed on to consumers, I think that's a question of every cost in business or every tax in business. Our rates are uniform among each industry, so the rate that everyone pays in the industry is the same. I think most of these considerations will be in the context of competitive markets and what the market will prevail. The small businesses, of course, are exempt. If their receipts are $1 million or less, they will not be subject to the gross receipt tax. They will continue to pay their corporate income tax. And basically, business has the same choice government does. You choose among your costs, you choose among your efficiencies, and you try to find a way to manage whenever you have adjustments in your cost structure. And this is no different than any other change people would have in their cost structure going forward. We recognize that it is an increase, but our thought here, once again, is the way to move this throughout the whole economy is to broaden the base so all sectors contribute and not just certain sectors. And as a result of that, we're allowed to have a much, much lower rate. Who will be impacted? As I mentioned before, small businesses will be exempt. 3/4 or 75% of the businesses in Illinois are small businesses below $1 million. Exports will be exempt. Essential products, I already mentioned, food and drugs, as well as Medicaid payments to doctors and hospitals will be exempt. Industries with alternative taxation, where they already have a gross receipt tax, largely gaming and insurance products, not the whole insurance industry, but their insurance products will be exempt. And also, we exempt not-for-profits. Jay Doherty lobbied me heavy and hard to do that. We wanted to make sure we taxed all those member revenues, but we got talked out of it. But in all seriousness, Washington does include not-for-profits in their tax base, but Illinois and Ohio does not. So our tax base, what we're taxing, is very, very close to Ohio's. We modeled it off of that, as most of our estimates do. And I should mention that the Ohio tax base was designed by the Ohio Business Roundtable as to what's appropriate to include in a gross receipt tax base. This next chart just gives you a quick comparison of Washington, a long-standing gross receipt tax, Ohio, adopted 2 years ago, Illinois, and what we call the Tribune estimate in their editorial, where they endorsed the gross receipt tax concept a few weeks ago. They were looking at a much larger tax base than we considered. This kind of summarizes what that does, but basically indicates that many of the things that were included in that original estimate that would have generated $13 billion in taxation, we exclude for the reasons that we cited. So rather than their tax base would have generated $13 billion, or 1% of $1.3 trillion in terms of all Illinois activity. Ours is a much smaller base, which I'll get to in a second. The next chart just summarizes for you the difference between our analysis and that published in the Tribune. Once again, their base was about $1.3 billion, but when you exclude small business and the combination rule in terms of intercompany activity, food and drugs, not-for-profits, exports, and various compliance adjustments, we remove $525 billion from the base and are down to $775 billion of the gross sales base. When you look at this tax in its entirety, in terms of how much we're proposing to take out of the economy, is about $6.3 billion. I'd make 2 points on that. One is that represents, in terms of fiscal 08 dollars, which is the amount of money we're talking about here, versus our fiscal 08 gross domestic product, as estimated by Global Insights, that estimates about 1% of our gross domestic product on average. I'd also mention the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club, when they made their recommendations, the total of the recommended tax increases they put forward were about $6 billion. Their recommendation was to tax individuals, to increase the corporate tax rate, which we think is ineffective and wouldn't produce what's expected, and to increase consumer sales taxes on services. Ours is raising the $6 billion, once again, from a much broader base throughout the entire economy rather than a narrow tax base. As a matter of comparison, the Washington State experience, they've had the gross receipt tax for the longest, although Delaware and Hawaii have it also. If you look at the data that's published, both in terms of their wage and salary employment since 1980, there's a solid line on top. They have outpaced the U.S. economy for 25 consecutive years. We also looked at the personal income growth and gross domestic product growth of of Washington, Delaware, and Hawaii, who have had this kind of tax in place for a number of years. For the last 10 years, Delaware and Washington, both in terms of personal income and GDP growth, outpaced the U.S. economy. Hawaii was a little bit below it. So there's no fundamental economic structuring issue here. I should also mention Ohio has a pretty diverse tax base. They have companies like Boeing, Starbucks, Costco, and who am I forgetting? Microsoft, how can you forget that? So very different companies. They've had this structure a very long time. There's no exodus to Oregon or to Idaho or British Columbia, certainly. So we think it's very comparable in terms of a diverse economy to do so. Going forward, I'm bringing this chart back up as a point of reference that this is the pension reform that puts our base existing budget in structural soundness both now and going forward to 2011. The following chart looks similar, but now we basically are adding in the new programs, that is the gross receipt tax, followed by the education funding proposals, the health insurance proposals. We're replacing the revenue lost by the lottery being leased, and also funding the debt service primarily for school construction. This is a 2008 chart and 2011. I recognize most of you can't read it, but it shows that once again, looking forward to 2011, we are in structural balance and in structural reform with a considerable surplus in our budget in those out years and not recreating the same problems that have plagued us for over 25 years. I should also emphasize not one nickel of the new revenues, not one nickel of the new revenues is going inside state government. It's going to local school districts, it's going to hospitals, it's going to doctors, it's going to individuals in terms of premium assistance, and it's going to fund construction programs. All into the Illinois economy, none of it into state government. In closing, I'm just going to touch on a little bit the capital budget, including many reappropriations, about $11 billion in the capital program. Much of that's in the pay-as-you-go road construction program of $1.8 billion. $650 of it is for public colleges and universities. $200 million next year is targeted for transit. And in terms of bond authorization, we're looking at $1.7 billion for school construction, $750 million for the governor's energy plan announced last year over several years to basically build and convert plants into ethanol plants, biodiesel plants, and coal gasification to make Illinois more energy independent. And the rest is for maintenance of state hospitals and prisons and additional money for public transit as well. So in sum, the fiscal year 08 budget is a balanced budget, both in terms of the existing base budget based on the pension reforms we've introduced, and also in terms of the new programs with a recurring, growing structural revenue source and funding our requirements for healthcare and education. The main increases are $1.5 billion of new money into P through 12 education, the primary grades through 12th grade, $568 million, half of which comes back from the federal government in terms of our existing Medicaid programs, $464 million in terms of the proposed first 6 months of the governor's proposed access to health care program, and the balance is in a series of state departments. But you'll notice that all those increases go to health care, education, both higher education, lower education, and health care, and all the rest of state government continues to reduce. There's no growth in that. It's actually a net reduction of about $8 million as a result of that. So in closing, we think this is a far-reaching proposal. It is bold, but we think it's the governor's responsibility as the state's chief executive to put the entirety of the state's issues on the table for discussion, analysis, and negotiation. It does provide a long-term revenue source to meet the ongoing costs of providing state services such as education and health care. It does propose to reform the state's existing tax system and include all sectors of the economy and not leave major ones out. It does provide every adult in this state with access to affordable health care as already provided for our state's children. It does provide our schools with the single largest one-year funding increase in history and a historic $10 billion investment over the next 4 years to take the pressure off of property taxes and make the state ultimately the primary funder of education. And it does improve pension funding and retire our 90% plan 5 years earlier, and as a result of it, saves $60 billion. So we do think it's a far-reaching budget, but we think it's appropriate in terms of what the state's requirements are to put all the issues on the table, to put them out there in a forthright way, and one that we could discuss and negotiate, and we think it does provide true structural reform in Illinois' budget. So with that, I'll be happy to take your questions.
If there's vodka, maybe that too. If you want it, Ms. Posner, first, well, okay. Firstest with the mostest, but the moderator has a question. Go ahead. Good. Just little moderator. Who's the moderator? Who is going to administer all of this?
Which list are we referring to?
If we cut state workers and you're adding all this other stuff, who's going to do the work?
It's a good question. I think the health care program is largely money, once again, that is being dispersed to the healthcare industry. And I should mention it's one of the fastest growing industries in Illinois and the highest job growth industry south of Springfield in doing so. So we're primarily talking about moving state dollars out to hospitals, physicians, and so on. The existing managed care program in the state is managed by third-party companies. So we don't contemplate a significant increase there, since this is a funding mechanism for the external economy, not an expansion of state government. Similarly, the structure for funding schools is set up through the existing State Board of Education. And what we're talking about is the same process, except the state's going to be sending that much more money out under the school aid formula and the special education formulas more so than it is today.
Kathy.
Okay, Kathy Posner. You gave us in one of your charts 3 choices for under raising taxes. One, the governor's plan that goes receipts tax. The other proposal, increasing taxes, income taxes, or sales tax. And your third one, which was called do nothing. That was your only thoughts of how we could get more money. But what's interesting is when you say the gross receipt tax won't be passed on to the customers, you say because businesses will choose to manage and reduce other costs. Why don't you have as one of your choices that the government will also choose to manage and reduce other costs? That's not even given as an alternative. You just want everyone else to pay for it, not the government to reduce. So my question is, why don't you have as one of your choices reducing government even more?
I think what I tried to suggest in the beginning, and certainly there's more to do, is the state employment payroll has been reduced 20%, 13,000 positions in the last 4 years. Unprecedented, not only in Illinois, unprecedented in this country. That's a much smaller government that saves $1 billion per year each and every year going forward. We came into office, we had 66 departments and boards in the budget. We now have 45.
I'm saying for the future. Why don't you have as one of the choices you are going to try to save money?
It's a good question. I did not go through the entire budget, but we have a number of things in the budget. An example, our shared services project that many people in here are familiar with that helped on is taking 104 accounting systems, 38 human resource systems, and 9 payroll systems, and moving all of those administrative functions now in 45 departments into 6 shared service centers to reduce the cost of the backroom operations of government and let departments focus on their frontline services. Those save monies. Those savings are in the budget.
Thank you, Kathy. Step right up.
Lisa Sword, the Auditors General just recently released a report that states that transit is in serious financial trouble to the tune of, I think, about $800 million to $1 billion per year. And yet the governor's budget doesn't address transportation or this need. Does the governor have plans to address transportation? And if so, can you elaborate on those?
Okay. Did Dennis Anasik ask you to ask that question, or was it? It's a very good question. What we do have in the budget is, the state does provide the debt service to pay for the bonds for all of the RTA's bonds, which are very, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but very, very substantial. It includes, of course, the member boards. We also put in the budget the $54 million of new funding we put in 2 years ago that actually was supposed to expire in 2 years, but as a good faith gesture, we did put in that additional $54 million to largely support the paratransit services now operated by PACE, but it had indirect assistance to the CTA as well. We have met with the RTA officials and others regarding their requests, both on the capital side and operating side, and I think there's as many opinions on how that should be funded as there are probably employees of the member boards. We believe it's something to be discussed in the General Assembly's upcoming session to get the input of the Senate and the House on how we arrive at what's the most effective way to support this. So we do have the $54 billion in the budget that we increased a couple of years ago, but we want to have the General Assembly have its say in this because it's clearly a major issue for the General Assembly. We wanted to focus the discussion on health care and education at this stage.
John, really a follow-up to that question, because you knew I would be getting up here. Oh, I'm sorry, Jackie Grimshaw, Center for Neighborhood Technology, and also the advisory board of the CTA. And that was my question as well. But one of the things that is impressive about the proposal you have for health care and education and pension reform is that the governor is taking the lead. And I think if we're going to have transit funding, the General Assembly obviously has to be involved, but I think the governor needs to take a lead as well and putting some proposals on the table that we can actually get the kind of funding that we have, because, like one of the things on the operating side, you talk about pensions with the state government. Well, the CTA pension is about to be bankrupt, at least in terms of the healthcare side. So, the leadership is all important. And so I guess my question is, what kind of leadership is the governor going to provide to the General Assembly to make sure that we have a resolution this year and that we're not continuing every year at the point of extinction for the CTA and the other transit boards?
Well, I think the governor will be actively engaged in the entire budget process, including the proposals, regarding transit. Not only transit in the 6-county area, but also transit downstate. The Governor's Office of Management and Budget has spent a great deal of time with the RTA staff and CTA staff analyzing the request and understanding it in the last couple of months. So we expect that to be, an active part of this spring's negotiations.
Well, my name is Michael Radzalowski. I'm a City Club member and also a lawyer. My question, this is like where the devil's always in the details, is why have private insurance companies manage the system? We just had the federal government go through this drug program, which if anybody can understand and explain it to me, I'd be happy to sit down and listen, because I had a couple of people who wanted me to explain what was more advantageous, but the whole idea of letting these insurance companies do it, rather than having a single payer system as the federal government has had for its own employees, I don't understand why it's considered more efficient to have a third party handle it, because my experience is most insurance companies find great ways not to pay claims.
It's a good question. I'd have to say first, this is not my area of expertise, but I think there is a lot of concern with a single-payer system in terms of operational efficiency and what government should do and should not do. We fund healthcare, but we're not healthcare providers. And I think the proper oversight of insurance and the proper regulation of insurance, together with effective delivery, is part of our responsibility to measure effective delivery. But I think we would be reluctant to get into the healthcare insurance and healthcare provision business in terms of a state's core responsibility.
Next. Two more. One more.
Hi, John. Mike Moses from S&C Electric Company. Under the current corporate income tax system, when a company exports sales to a state that doesn't have an income tax obligation and those sales are reallocated back to Illinois, that's the throwback rule, will gross receipts apply to those sales, or will they be considered export sales and not subject to gross receipts?
The rule is basically verbatim of the Ohio rule. Again, it's important to understand for the business community, the Ohio statute and this rule was written by the Ohio Business Roundtable. The rule is what's called benefits received. So the extent to which the benefit of the sale is received across Illinois' borders, then the Illinois seller of that product would not be subject to the GRT tax. So a good example would be Caterpillar. The extent to which Caterpillar sells a tractor to an Illinois business where they are receiving Illinois services, have access to Illinois' economy, they would pay the GRT. If it's sold to a farming organization in Indiana or India, for that matter, it would not be subject to the gross receipt tax. That's important to emphasize. Is the principle behind here is that all companies benefit from Illinois state services. Higher education alone, which helps business, we pay over $3 billion a year for with state budgetary money. Our P-12 system, our state police system, the transit system, those are all state funds. So the principle behind a gross receipt tax is both a privilege tax in terms of access to our economy and a surrogate, if you will, for the use of state services that all companies enjoy, no matter what they might report as their profits. But I think, to answer your question once again, I think the example you gave sounds like it would fall under the benefits received rule.
Rika Sloan. Hi, John. I had a question about the pension plans going forward. Most private sector corporations, I guess, have gone now from defined benefits to a defined contributions type of pension system. If we remain with defined benefits for all the employees and teachers going forward, what does that imply about ever being able to catch up in relation to changing the nature of the entitlement going forward?
Well, I think what this proposal does is try to catch up dramatically on what was left behind and not attended to. I think defined benefit plans are a challenge for not only public but private employers in managing them going forward, but it's largely a collective bargaining issue, with the respective unions in the state. We have increased their contributions over the last 4 years. 4 years ago, through an earlier negotiation, state employees were not making pension contributions, whereas teachers and university employees were. We made some other changes to make that much more affordable, and some would argue that more needs to be done, but it's really a collective bargaining issue that I probably shouldn't talk about our thoughts on that here.
How about a nice round of applause?
these things?
In case the collections are coming in too fast enough, there's a cup from the city club you may have.
Wonderful.
You have a 1-year membership. It's called a gross membership tax, where you just pay it one time and on all the services you receive. How many of these you have? Plenty, right?
I don't think I have that one.
Now you have the history of the
do.
city club.
Okay.
Okay, now you have another one. Thank you all, and by the way, get your reservations in Springfield. August is beautiful. Adjourned.